Spring is in the air, so let's talk about Flower, the artsy PS3 game where the player gives a helping hand to Mother Nature. That game company's Genova Chen is here to share some insight on the game's creation, and PlayStation guru Ryan Clements actually reviewed the game pretty highly. I myself have played through it about 3 times, so we're both dying to ask some questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jess. So Genova, you and I have met a few times before Flower's release, and so what I want to know now is just what interests you about this game. And I think maybe if we could start with one of the first things you see when Flower boots up, besides the credits, which is the room that serves as the hub for all the levels.
Sure. The storyline, or the game, is very much about how we can preserve that familiarity towards the urban life, meanwhile give the player exciting adventure towards the nature. I realized one thing, that is, after the initial high, you go into that space, in about 5 minutes you feel lonely, then you feel nervous. I think it's the fact that there's nothing related to human or to civilizations. It feels unsafe. And I find if I add a little house, in the distance, or a skyline of city somewhere, it feels a lot better. I think it's just kind of irony that, as a human who grew up in the city, we wanted to venture out to the nature, but then we also can't completely detach from the nature. So right at the beginning, we are in a room that is kind of the extreme version of urban minus nature. So it's the downside you would remember as a man who lived in a city. Outside it's just noise and gray. And but then you zoom into a flower. So you go into his desire, his dream, which is based on what he sees in the city that day. Initially, we actually have a lengthy story about a guy who lives in the city. So the room is actually his room, and the story is about him. And we write up all the things about him, but then as we develop the game, we find the gameplay is so abstract. It's so simple. It feels too much to have a story of a human being. And so we kind of basically cut out the entire story of the guy, but we left his room to be the thing that's driving the game.
Cool. So Genova, one of the things I was hoping you could talk about is just some of the inspirations for this first level here and how you arranged it in this way, because I feel like this level has some of the best arrangement in terms of the design of how the flowers are structured.
Well, is it the best or is it the easiest?
Maybe a little bit of both.
I think basically early on when we create the level, it's a lot more organic. We did a lot of playtest. We did more playtest than any AAA game actually for this particular game, because we know people's gonna be like, what the heck is this game? What am I supposed to do? So we wanted to make the first level very apparent in terms of where you're supposed to go. So we kind of tried a lot of different ways. We tried a version where it's like a star and you kind of follow the path, and people just get lost. And because this is the very first level, they don't really understand how to play with the controls yet. We noticed a lot of new players, they would like to fly very high and then they look down, and we were like, maybe we should just make the grass some kind of graph they can guess what they need to do. So it's very tutorial level.
Well, I found what was interesting is that it is very a peaceful world. Obviously, you do kind of have an enemy in the fact that you have this urban jungle that's attacking nature, and yet earlier you said, well, when we were making and designing the game, we found it was a lot easier for the player to kind of feel the peaceful nature of nature by having like a house right in the background. So now all of a sudden your like beneficial centering object, which is the city that you have in the background, becomes your enemy. So was that a conscious choice or?
Okay, so as I said, I love city and urban life, and I also like nature, so I never wanted to make this game an eco-terrorist game, which is like, oh, our urban civilization is bad, so the nature is taking over. I think, that's just not absolutely correct to most of the people. So when we designed the level in the city, we actually want to have this feeling that you're here to help the city, to awaken the life that's hidden and that's sleeping in this fallen city. At the very beginning of the city level, I don't know if you remember, there are these buildings and lamps that kind of grow like a grass and flowers. It's kind of like the symbol that even the concrete structure could have life, and you can awaken that aspect from them. So in terms of boss fight, well, boss fight is a classic gameplay mechanics, the elements people always talk about. But I think in Flower, we shouldn't really say it's a boss fight because the boss doesn't fight back. It's more of a trying to create a climax, to help the players' emotions to reach a high and then release them, so that they can have, a much better experience to think about the game. So we were thinking about, well, what could be, the boss, well, the climax. So we introduced this concept of these kind of gridders, like they are kind of organic, but also, very sharp. And a lot of people see connection of them towards, the garbage, see them connection to industrializations, because we intentionally trying to make it vague, because we don't want to say, this particular industrialization is bad. Really what you do in the end, you just purify the negativity and awaken the positive.
So we're about to get to one of my favorite parts in the game, which is reaching the very end of this quote-unquote boss fight. Can you talk about these images that you're about to see right at the end when you kind of, elevate right into the climax of the city here?
So while you're rising, it looks like, a light hitting a flower, like basically light emitting, creating a flower image. And the structure of the tower has almost like a hand at the top, kind of like TGC logo. And it's more like, to me, it's like a blooming flower shape. And then there's the window seal. And I'm actually curious how you feel about when you first see the window and the flower pot at the top.
Well, personally, I think it's sort of creating that loop where you start off every level in the beginning of the game in the room, kind of going through into the flower's dream. And in that, you're sort of going from the dream back into reality and going through that window and kind of completing the entire cycle.
Wow.
That's the interpretation.
I guess
What he said.
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing.
So yeah, that's the answer.
There's only one.
All right, well, that's awesome. Well, I hate to wrap this up, but we're running out of time. Thank you so much. It's very cool, and it's actually great to see games that aren't your typical first-person shooter for a change. For you at home that are interested, and why wouldn't you be, Flower is now available on PSN.